also comes responsibility. So when you go back to this list of who owns what, and you go through each of these categories, you can see the battle for control and the battle for openness. And it's so important because what we see then is that interoperable web services, open data, and standard protocols for interchange are at least as important as open source code if our goal is really to have a collaborative community architecture. Now, in that regard, there's one kind of hopeful sign, and that is that the underdog is the ally of open source. So if you look at, I actually predict that we'll see some really interesting open source, open data initiatives from Microsoft in the area of search, because they will realize, oh, that's how we compete against Google. In the area of maps, where Google is becoming dominant, we see Microsoft, Nokia, Yelp, Foursquare, perhaps, doing interesting open things. In speech recognition, Nuance and Microsoft, who have great speech assets, again, I would think might be doing some interesting things with open source. Social graph, Facebook is the dominant player, so of course Google is doing open social. Payment, PayPal, I think, is going to be a friend of open source there. In cloud infrastructure, companies like VMware and Rackspace. Google is already in smartphones playing the open card. Same thing with device operating systems. So when you look at companies like Facebook or Google, and you look at their open source plans, what you'll see is most of their focus of open source is on stuff that somebody else owns. They're not really open sourcing the stuff that's their core strength. They're open sourcing the other guy's core strength. And that's good and bad. I mean, the good side is it means there's a lot more good free code out there. And it's also true that I've never been an open source purist. Like, Facebook Connect is awesome. You know, it lets you get access to Facebook's social graph, and it's open enough as long as Facebook doesn't at some point decide, now we're really in the driver's seat, and let's leverage it in some way that's unpleasant for developers. But still, it's good for the competition that there is open social and things like that, and things like Salmon, which are, how do we actually propagate comments in an open web way. There's some really cool work happening and being coordinated through groups like the Open Web Foundation. But we have to realize that open is not going to stick around unless we get ahead of the curve and we think about what it means in the context of these new services. I want to mention also there's a whole aspect around corporate data sharing. I gave a talk recently at a Greenplum conference. Now, Greenplum is a massively scalable Postgres data warehouse platform for businesses. And they run things like the New York Stock Exchange, Orbitz, T-Mobile, a lot of big corporate sites. And they point out they have a lot of data there. And they recently introduced this project called Chorus, which is about how can those sites start to publish their data as an open data feed that can be consumed by developers. So you want to pay attention to this, because I think that the open data movement is going to be as important to as the open source movement, and it's going to be really important for your future. If you're a developer who builds data-driven sites, think about data that's not just coming from your users, from your sites, but coming from other sites, because in this future, cooperating data sites are a big part of this internet operating system. I'm going to switch tracks a little bit.